Hey people, it's Niles talking. Now, this is Black Holocaust Sundown Towns, and I'm using the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. Sundown Towns, aka racial cleansing. Between 1890 and 1968, thousands of towns across the United States drove out their black populations or took steps to forbid African Americans from living in them. First were created sundown towns, so named because many marked the city limits with signs typically reading N-word, don't let the sun go down on you in Alex, an Arkansas town in Franklin County that had such a sign around 1970. By 1970, when sundown towns were at their peak, more than half of all incorporated communities outside the traditional South probably excluded African Americans, including more than 100 towns in the northwestern two-thirds of Arkansas. White residents of the traditional South rarely engaged in the practice. They kept African Americans down, but hardly drove them out. Accordingly, no sundown town has yet been confirmed in the southeastern third of Arkansas that lies east of a line from Bright Star, Miller County, to Blytheville, Mississippi County, and only 3 likely suspects have emerged. Sundown towns in Arkansas range from hamlets like Alex to larger towns like Paragould, Greene County, and Springdale, Washington County. Entire counties went sundown, such as Boone, Clay, and Polk. Some multi-county areas also kept out African Americans. In Mississippi County, for example, according to historian Michael Dugan, a red line that was originally a road surveyor's mark defined a dead line beyond which African Americans might trespass to the west. That line apparently continued northeast in the Missouri Boot Heel and southwest to Lepanto, Poinsett County, delineating more than 2,000 square miles. Although there were not towns like these prior to the Civil War, precedents existed for the exclusion of free African Americans. As early as 1843, Arkansas denied free blacks entry into the state, and in 1859, Arkansas required such persons to leave the state by January 1st, 1860, or be sold into slavery. Moreover, in 1864, the Loyalist Arkansas faction passed a new state constitution that abolished slavery but excluded African Americans from moving into the state. However, that constitution never went into effect, and during Reconstructions, African Americans participated politically across the state. In 1890, every county had at least 6 African Americans, and only one had fewer than 10. Then, between 1890 and 1940, white residents forced African Americans to make a great retreat in Arkansas and across the north. During this nadir of race relations, lynchings peaked, and unions drove African Americans from such occupations as railroad, fireman, and meat cutter. Democrat Jeff Davis ran for Arkansas governor in 1900, 1902, and 1904, and then for U.S. Senate in 1906. His language grew more negrophobic with each campaign. "We have come to a parting of the ways," the Negro shouted. "The brutal criminals of that race lay unholy hands upon our fair daughters. Nature is so riven and shocked. The dire compact produces social cataclysm." White people responded with violence. By 1830, 3 Arkansas counties had no African Americans at all, and another 8 had fewer than 10, all in the Arkansas Ozarks. By 1966, 6 counties had no African Americans: Baxter, Fulton, Polk, Erie, Sharp, and Stone. 7 more had 1 to 3, and yet another county had 6. All 14 were probably sundown counties. 8 had been confirmed. Much of this area had been Unionist during the Civil War, and I want to take a moment to point this out. People love to talk about the North being this good place where slavery didn't happen. And in many ways, these were more racist than the places where slavery did happen or was prevalent up until the Civil War. As we can see, a lot of the... I was reading another article, and maybe I'll put it in if I can find it, which is that the most sundown towns were actually in the north, in Illinois and Indiana. But anyway, let's keep reading. Until 1890, white residents had maintained fairly good relations with their small African American populations, partly because African Americans and white non-Democrats were political allies. Then election law changes and Democrat violence made interracial coalitions impractical. Now it could not pay to be anything but a Democrat. Allied with this Democratic resurgence, a wave of new Confederate nationalism swept Arkansas. Most Ozark County histories written after 1890 tell of the war exclusively from the Confederate point of view. More than ever, it was in the interest of white populations to distance themselves from African Americans. Precisely in counties where residents had been Unionists, white residents now often seem impelled to prove themselves ultra-Confederate and manifested the most robust anti-black fervor. Often the expulsion of African Americans was forced. Harrison, Boone County, for example, had been a reasonably peaceful biracial town in the early 1890s. There was never a large Negro population, according to Boone County historian Ralph Freer, probably never more than 300 or 400, but they had their church, their social life. In Maine, there was little friction between them and the whites. Then, in late September of 1905, a white mob stormed the jail, carried several black prisoners outside the town, whipped them, and ordered them to leave. The rioters then swept through Harrison's black neighborhood, tying men to trees, whipping them, burning several homes, and warning all African Americans to leave that night. Most fled without any belongings. And I want to take a moment to say this. They keep talking about reparations a long time ago, or people weren't slaves. This was happening 40 or 50 years after slavery had ended, and no one received any compensation for all the property destroyed or things that had to be abandoned or under threat of death. These things were just taken, and if you can't, and if you feel sad about them being lost, oh well. 3 or 4 wealthy white families sheltered servants who stayed on, but in 1909, another mob tried to lynch a black prisoner. Fearing for their lives, most remaining African Americans left. Harrison remained a sundown town at least until 2002. Again, this stuff is not ancient history. It's very, very recent. Similarly, Mena, Polk County had a small black population until February 20th, 1901, when a mentally impaired African American badly injured a 12-year-old white girl. A white mob then took him from jail, fractured his skull, shot him, and cut his throat. In the aftermath, Polk County's black residents fled. And people keep talking about black people being violent. Remember something, this was a mentally impaired or disabled African American. Now, the thing to do would obviously put him into a mental hospital, but they thought, hey, any black person harming a white person needs to have swift retaliation. Some of these riots in turn spurred whites in nearby smaller towns to hold their own, thus provoking little waves of explosions. The Boone County events probably led to ejections from neighboring counties in the early 1920s. William Pickens saw sundown signs across the Ozarks. By 1830, the region's black population had shrunk to half its pre-Civil War total. Sundown towns often allowed 1 or 2 African Americans to remain, even while posting signs warning others not to stay the night. In Harrison, for example, James Wilson met the 1909 mob at his door with a shotgun and protected his house servant, Electa Smith. Later, she insisted that her name was Electa Caledonia Melvina Smith, but she also let white people call her Aunt Vine, which paid along with the inferior status connoted by uncle and auntie as applied to older African Americans and helped her survive in an otherwise all-white community. Several Arkansas counties and towns showed a slowly diminishing number of African Americans between 1890 and 1940 because they did not allow new black people in, and those who remained gradually died or left. Sundown towns showed astonishing tenacity. In the early 1900s, for example, pioneering archaeologist Clarence Moore dared not proceed beyond Lepanto on the Little River for fear of endangering his black crew members. Dan and Phyllis note that race relations remain strained in that region, a polite way of saying that African Americans still do not and perhaps cannot live safely in that area a century later. Sundown towns have achieved stability by a variety of means. Some towns people painted black mules on barns or rock outcrops, signaling to all that no black ass was allowed to spend the night. In Mena, African Americans did not even have to stop to get in trouble. Shirley Manning, a high school student there in 1960-61, described the scene. The local boys were threatened with words and knives. Negroes who would come through the town and followed them to the outskirts of the town, shouting, "Better not let the sun set on your black ass in Mena, Arkansas," and they often bumped the car with their bumper from behind. I was along in a car which did this once, and I saw it done more than once. An undated newspaper clipping from Rogers, Benton County, probably between 1910 and 1920, tells of the terror that African Americans might encounter in sundown towns, even during the day. A Benton County contractor was building a brick building in Rogers and brought with him a black hod carrier. A group of young men were gathered in the Blue Saloon where the Negro entered, probably looking for his employer. The group seized the Negro man, telling him what they were going to do him. They threatened to drop him in an old well in the rear of the construction site after they had hanged him. But the others objected on the ground that the odor from the ones already planted there was becoming objectionable to the neighborhood. Eventually, they let the trembling Negro slip, and in a matter of seconds, he was just a blur on the horizon. The incident was meant to be funny, for had the men been serious, they could have easily apprehended the gunnery. Yet it was not entirely in jest, for it accomplished the man's unemployment, surely one of its aims. Again, all this racial terrorism causes unemployment and poverty. The same people who talk about blacks not having jobs will be the same people who will terrorize them and call the cops on them if they see them in their neighborhood, even in work uniforms or for any reason. And we've all heard this whole Karen thing. What are you doing here? Can I see some ID? Oh, you're just fake. Let me call your employer, etc., etc. Just another form of terrorism to ensure black people do not have jobs. Economic boycott has kept many African Americans out of sundown towns. As motel owner Nick Kahn said about Paragould in 2002, if black people come in, they will find that they're not welcome here. No one will hire them. Whites who might defy the ban face reprisals. In 1969, a choir from Southern Baptist College performed in Harrison. One choir member was black, and a couple put her up for the night. But we worried lest our house get blown up, remember the wife. Despite being warned not to, Kahn hired an African American to work his motel in 1982. His transient clientele gave him a form of economic independence. Sundown towns continued to form in Arkansas as late as 1954, and white residents of Sheridan and Grant County rid themselves of their black neighbors in response to Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. The owner of the local sawmill and sawmill workers' homes were principally responsible. He made his African American employees an extraordinary offer. He would give them their homes and move them to Malvern, Hot Spring County, 25 miles west at no cost to them. If a family refused to move, he would evict them and burn down their home. Unsurprisingly, African Americans chose to leave. The few other African Americans in Sheridan, preachers, independent business operators, suddenly found themselves without a clientele. They left too afterward. Sheridan therefore developed a reputation for aggressively anti-black behavior. Some small communities in Arkansas may have gotten rid of their African Americans after Brown. Hate groups have long been drawn to sundown towns. Harrison developed a large Ku Klux KKK chapter that targeted striking railroad workers in the 1920s, hanging one from a railroad bridge in 1923 and escorting the rest to the Missouri line. KKK leaders still live in the Harrison area. Gerald L. K. Smith, a radio evangelist and leading anti-Semite in the 1930s and 40s, moved his headquarters to Eureka Springs, Carroll County, partly because it was an all-white town. Historian Patrick Huber calls the expulsion by which Ozark communities became sundown towns, defining events in the history of their communities. Nevertheless, despite their importance, or rather because of it, most sundown towns have kept hidden the means by which they became and stayed white. Sociologist Gordon Morgan, trying in 1973 to uncover the history of African Americans in the Ozarks, wrote, "Some white towns have deliberately destroyed reminders of the blacks who lived there years ago. To this day, other than by oral history, some sundown towns are hard to research because communities took pains to ensure that nothing about their policy was written. The Rogers Historical Museum has done an exemplary job of preserving an example of this suppression. In 1962, the Rogers Daily News upset the local Chamber of Commerce by using the following language in the front page editorial lauding a successful Fats Domino concert. The city, which once had signs posted at city limits and at rail terminals boasting, 'Nigger, you better not let the sun get set on you' in Rogers, were hosting its first top-name entertainer, a Negro, at night. The Chamber called the newspaper editor to task and asked its Public Relations Committee to keep a close watch on future news reporting and take any appropriate action should further detriment to the city of Rogers be detected." And I want to take a moment to stop and say, again, we hear about all these schools and education boards in Florida and elsewhere saying we don't want critical race theory to be taught. And it's basically the people who didn't want blacks in their neighborhoods to go to schools now saying we don't want black people to be taught that we didn't want blacks to go to our neighborhoods or schools. And personally, I say that this is pretty much to be predicted. I always say that there should be black schools for black children where they teach this truth, because you can't rely on a white school to teach them things that make them look bad. Why would they do so? Anyway, let's move on for that tangent. Some Arkansas towns have long used their racial composition as a selling point to entice new residents. Mena advertised what it had: cool summers, mild winters, and did not have no blizzards, no Negroes. In its 1907 guide and directory, Rogers competed by bragging about its 7 churches, 2 public schools, 1 academy, 1 sanatorium. Noted, Rogers has no Negroes or saloons. Not to be outdone, nearby, Siloam Springs, Benton County, claimed healing waters, beautiful parks, many springs, public library alongside noble area, no mosquitoes, and no Negroes. The pitch worked. A 1972 survey of Mountain Home, Baxter County, residents found many retirees from northern cities who chose Mountain Home partly because it was all white. A reporter in Mena wrote in 1980, "It is not a common experience in Polk County to hear a newcomer remark that he chose to move here because of low taxes and no N-words." For 15 years after the 1964 Civil Rights Act, motel and restaurants in which some sundown towns continue to exclude African Americans. Today, public accommodations are generally open. More than half of all Arkansas sundown towns have given up their exclusionary residential policies, mostly after 1990. Of 4 suspected sundown counties in 1960, 8 showed at least 3 African American households in the 2000 census. Additional white households now include black children, especially interracial offsprings of white mothers from the community and black partners from elsewhere. The public schools of Sheridan desegregated around 1992 when students from 2 small nearby biracial communities were included in the new consolidated high school. In about 1995, a black family moved into Sheridan. Before the decade ended, it was joined by 3 more. Slow progress, but progress nevertheless. Some towns still merit the term, however. Smokey Crabtree, long-time resident of Fouke, Miller County, wrote in 2001, "As far back as the late 20s, colored people were welcomed in Fouke, Arkansas to live or to work in the town. The city put up an almost life-size chalk statue of a colored man at the city limit line, had an iron bar in one hand, was pointing out of town with the other hand. The city kept the statue painted and dressed, really taking good care of it. Back in those days, colored people were run out of Fouke. One was even hung from a large oak tree. As of this, there are no colored people living within miles of Fouke. So the attention getter, the means to shake the little town up, isn't the Russians are coming, it's someone is importing colored people into town." Sundown reputations persist. "Never walk in Greenwood or you will die," a black Arkansas college student said in 2002. The 2000 census showed 2 African-American households in Greenwood, Sebastian County. However, so his information may be out of date, but such reputations can be self-maintaining. I hope you've enjoyed this. Please comment, rate, share, and subscribe. Peace.